Good evening, everybody. As we enter liturgical year, cycle B, we hear the Gospel of Mark each day. So over these two sessions, I would like to help you as you go online for Mass, because I'm sure most of you are going online at the moment. But as you go online, I would like to help you to listen and to hear the Gospel of Mark with different ears, just to see, do you get any message from Mark that's relevant to your life today? To do so requires mindful presence. Mindful presence is kernel to listening to the Gospel of Mark. And to do so, we need to pay attention with intention as we listen and grasp the message as it's coming through the Gospel. Very often the message is relevant just now in my life. It's amazing how some days when we pay attention with intention, the message is relevant just at this point in time. Listening and reading injects some thought. And with thought comes feeling, comes emotion, and life's events become very real when we pay attention with intention and as we listen and as we read. Just to give you an example of that for me, a number of years ago, I can remember reading Alice Taylor's first book, To School Through the Fields. And as I read it, one story particularly stands out in my mind. Alice describing how we took our drink to school each day in a wire sauce bottle, and how it was so difficult to get the taste of the wire sauce out of the bottle. It took a few trips to school and a few trips home to get the taste of the wire sauce out of the bottle. And then placing the bottle in front of the fire at school and rotating it throughout the morning to make sure that it was warm at lunchtime. For me, that was a real moment of memory. It evoked a lot of feeling, it evoked a lot of emotion. I had totally forgotten that experience. I had forgotten that experience to the point where it would never have been passed on to my children unless I had read that story at that point in time. Then, of course, what came next? I can remember getting my first flask from Santa Claus. And as a result of reading Alice's story, I actually could remember that first flask, even what it looked like. So that is what reading and listening can do for us. And it is with that type of paying attention with intention, I would like to encourage you to listen to the Gospel of Mark. The Gospels are a collection of stories. That's really all they are. They're a collection of stories, testimonies, relating to a period in time. And the period in time is particularly during the life of Jesus Christ. They vary in length. We know there are four particular Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. They vary in length. They vary in style. They vary in emphasis. And why do they vary? They vary because they're very much influenced by the time they were written. They're influenced by the political forces, the social forces, the economic forces, the culture of the people at that point in time. But they're also very influenced by the person who wrote them, the style of the author. So it is very much the style of Mark I would like to introduce you to in these two sessions. When we get to understand the style, we very much understand the message a little more. The message makes sense when you look at the style. Mark's Gospel is the shortest of the Gospels, and it is the earliest of the Gospels. It is attributed to Mark, the Evangelist, and he was an associate of St. Paul. And certainly we know St. Paul was a force to be reckoned with. Mark was also a disciple of Peter. So he got first-hand from Peter what it was like to walk the hills with Jesus Christ. Thought to be written around the time of the Jewish war, certainly around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. So it was a time for a very traumatized period during the people it was being written for. They were a people of faith. They were extremely traumatized by war. They desperately were looking for hope. And this is the time that Mark wrote his gospel, during a time for a people of faith, but very traumatized period of time in their history. It is claimed that both Matthew and Luke used the Gospel of Mark to write theirs. For many, many years, it would have been considered the Cinderella of the Gospels, simply because when Luke produced his, Luke produced 1,149 verses, as opposed to Mark's 662 verses, very different in length. But certainly I would ask you to look at the quality rather than the quantity. It really is a gospel of great, great quality. Mark's gospel, even though it is very short, it has had an immense impact in some people's lives. And just to give you an example of the impact it has had, one of the examples I would like to give you is a gentleman called Jürgen Moltmann. Jürgen Moltmann was a German, fought for the Nazi regime and became a prisoner of war in 1945 in Scotland. And during his time as a prisoner of war, he was shown some photographs of the atrocities that had happened in the concentration camps. And certainly it had an enormous effect on him. Now, the day of reckoning for Moltmann and the regime he was part of caused him great mental torture. And to help him, some of the prison chaplains gave him a copy of the Bible to read. And he decided that he would read the Gospel of Mark, probably because it was the shortest. And it had an enormous impact on Moltmann. Thereafter, he became a theologian, and he was certainly known as a theologian of liberation and hope. And just to give you a glimpse of the impact it had on Moltmann, I just would like to quote these words for you. I read Mark's Gospel as a whole and came to the story of the Passion. When I heard Jesus' death cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? I felt growing within me the conviction, this is someone who understands you completely, who is with you in your cry to God and has felt the same forsakenness you are living right now. Then I summoned up the courage to live again. Let's see. That's just one example of how Mark has impacted on somebody. Let's listen to Mark over the coming days and weeks, and let's see how it might impact on us on the 21st century in the middle of a pandemic. We too are traumatized people right now. We're very similar to the people that were there when this gospel was written by Mark. Maybe, as Moltmann said, it will give us the courage to live again. And wouldn't that be a wonderful thing if it does that for us? Mark's gospel, unlike any of the others, it begins by pushing Jesus right onto the stage. There's no introduction, no genealogy, no Christmas story, no childhood events. Jesus, as the adult, comes straight onto the stage in Mark's Gospel. The curtain goes up and we're told about the Anointed One. Very similar to the prophets of old in the Old Testament, they too were deemed anointed ones. They spoke of God and they spoke as God. And their mission was very similar: preaching, advocacy, action, life experience. This is the way Jesus was pushed onto the stage by Mark, straight on, as if very similar to the prophets of old. The Gospel of Mark, and I think this is a really important point, the Gospel of Mark is not a biography. It's a collection of stories and testimonies. It's not a biography, it's a proclamation. We talk about the proclamation of the kingdom. This is what the Gospel of Mark is. And then we might ask ourselves, well, what is a proclamation? It's an official announcement dealing with a matter of great importance. So this is the way Mark takes on the Gospel. He wants to announce something of great importance. And the role of the evangelist is not to give us an account, a day-by-day account of the life of Jesus Christ. The role of the evangelist is to help us to understand the signs that Jesus Christ used in order to help us understand Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Son of God, the faith that we needed to build in him, the life that we will find through him, and certainly, above all, to encounter God through Jesus Christ. So that is the role of the gospel. It's not to give us a blow-by-blow account as a biography would. This evening I would like to look at two themes that stand out in the Gospel of Mark. One is this whole notion of kingdom of God, the proclamation of the kingdom of God. And the second one is this concept of discipleship. Next week, I would like to talk to you a little bit about Mark, his literary style. He had a very, very unusual literary style, and we might have a look at that next week. This evening, just let's look at the kingdom. When we talk about the kingdom of God, we think kingship, we think monarchy, we think supreme, we think power, we think castles. It just has this imagery when you use those words. That imagery would have been quite okay for the people at that point in time. They were used to the Roman Empire. They were used to kingships. They would also, of course, have been very familiar with the Psalms. And the Psalms had a beautiful set of Psalms, the Royal Psalms. And the Royal Psalms were very much about kingship and David and Solomon. And of course, then there was the kingship of Yahweh Psalms, so this type of terminology was very familiar to them. The kingdom of God and kingship was very familiar to them. And of course, Mark sets the scene. He doesn't really waste any time. Mark 1:15 says, "The time has come. The kingdom of God is at hand." So you're flung onto the stage straight away. Change your ways and believe the good news. So it's a very stark message, very quickly. So the time has come. So what were they to assume? The promises of the Old Testament are here. The promise of the Messiah is here. The kingdom of God is at hand. So their perception, yes, was very definitely of kings, warriors, battles, victories, Roman Empire defeated. God alone knows what these downtrodden people were thinking. And then one must consider what arrived. A carpenter's son from a small village in Nazareth. That must have caused a lot of confusion. So really, I think this is where the first stark message comes in the Gospel of Mark. He didn't come to defeat the Roman Empire. He didn't come as a warrior. He came to conquer evil. It is an entirely different battle. So it was a war against evil he came for, and it was the story of salvation for humanity. That was a very difficult message to get across for Mark, because these people obviously had very different perceptions of what was coming. Like every good storybook, it's a great storybook. Like every good storybook, there are players and characters, and you do have to look at their roles, because the roles that all those characters have tell a lot about the story. They all contribute to the meaning of the story. For a lot of you listening, I'm sure you will remember studying a Shakespearean play for your junior cert. My date was the inter-cert and the leaving cert. And we had to study every character, because every character had a role, and that role was important in the story. Mark's gospel is the very same. There were lots of characters. The Jewish leaders, they were a force to be reckoned with. They saw Jesus Christ as a huge threat. They didn't believe in him. They accused him of blasphemy. And as time went on, the more they became threatened by him, they were his enemies, and they really wanted rid of him. It was very, very difficult setting for him. But Mark really describes their role very, very well to us. Then, of course, we had the disciples. Now, discipleship, the disciples were a collection of followers, not just the 12 apostles. They were particularly 12 chosen, but there were lots of disciples. These were the people that followed him around the mountains and into the villages and sat listening on the mountain and shared the food of the loaves and fishes. So he had lots of followers, so lots of disciples. And in Mark's gospel, we discover a lot about them. While they were a people of faith, there was a lot of work to be done in solidifying and building that faith. There's lots of episodes where we see, was their faith quite as strong as they thought they had brought from their ancestors? They found it very difficult to understand him. They certainly, many times, they missed the point. And certainly we have numerous occasions where they were so traumatized and downtrodden, their courage let them down. Certainly up to and including the point of denying him on a number of occasions. They found it very difficult. Then, of course, you had the ordinary people. And the ordinary people, lots of examples of the ordinary people and their response to faith. For example, the woman who just barely touched his cloak, and knowing by just barely touching his cloak she was going to be cured. That was immense faith. And we've lots of examples of the ordinary people, the faith of the ordinary people. And it's the faith of the ordinary people that helps a downtrodden and a traumatized nation. We have seen it many times in Ireland. The faith of the Celtic people, the faith of the people that were downtrodden during famine Ireland, and hopefully the faith of the people who are now going through the pandemic. Honest to God faith can move mountains, and we have one such story in Mark that tells us that. And of course then we had the character, the centre of the story, with Jesus Christ himself. And Mark paints a very human side to Jesus. He paints the divine side to him, but he also paints the very, very human side to Jesus. He's a very compassionate person, and as he interacts, he can't ever say no. And when he finds it very hard to say no, in his healing and in his ministry. Yet, he asks them a lot, keep this a secret. I'm healing you and off you go. Don't tell anybody. This is what we call the great Masonic secret, because it's not time yet to reveal the great divine Masonic story. And he wants them to see the ordinary, everyday work of God in his work. Not the great. He doesn't want to be judged by his great Masonic work. There's a very human side, the compassionate side. Now, there's also the very impatient side. And we see this demonstrated a number of times with the disciples. He gets very impatient when they don't understand him. He gets impatient when they doubt him. So there is an impatient side to him. And of course, we also see a very angry side, authoritative side. For example, when he goes to the temple and he drives all the buyers and sellers out of the temple, he can get quite cross and furious. So Mark has a beautiful way of showing us the human side of Jesus, warts and all, that we understand in our own stories. And then, of course, there's the divine side, which Mark gets across beautifully. The very first line of the gospel is the beginning of the good news of Jesus, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The very first line you're told, you're going to get good news. It's the good news of Jesus Christ, and he's telling you straight away he's the Son of God. So, as I explained earlier, he sets the scene. Thereafter, the kingdom of God starts unfolding in the stories. And we suddenly discover that the kingdom of God is not a place. It's not a physical place. The kingdom of God is actually the work of God in action every day as he walks the mountains, as he heals the sick, as he explains forgiveness, as he raises the dead. It's the everyday work, and as he mingles with the people. This is the kingdom of God he's trying to explain. It's not a place, it's not a castle, it's everyday work. The other thing that becomes very evident in Mark's gospel is that the kingdom of God is for everybody. It wasn't for the chosen few. It's for the poor, it's for the rich, it's for the sinners, it's for the demonized, it's for the lot. He came to give the kingdom of God to everybody. All that was required in response was faith and conversion. Change your ways, and listen to the good news. And really, that's all that was required. Faith and conversion. The kingdom of God is very much the work on earth. Our participation is crucial. Mark never, throughout the entire story, it comes to an entire crescendo in the passion and death. That's the crescendo for Mark. The passion, the death, and the resurrection. The bulk of his gospel centres on that area. Once the resurrection comes, Mark's gospel comes to a very abrupt end. Because really this for Mark is the entire story. Passion, death, and resurrection. But he never lets us lose sight of the cross throughout the entire gospel. He introduces the cross there very early, and he reminds us of it on a number of occasions throughout his gospel. He reminds us of the passion through a very human Jesus who has come to serve. We see a great example of servant leadership here. He has come to serve up to and including giving his life. That is some servant leadership. Then I suppose, what do we see in the disciples? They're a kind of a motley bunch. A bunch of fishermen, tax collectors, you name it. They're not saints. They're by no means saints. They had to develop their faith the same as everybody else through learning from him. We see a lot of doubt. We see a lot of fear. We see a lot of lacking of courage in the disciples. We see them denying him. The first time we see any reasonable acknowledgement coming from the discipleship is quite late. It's in Mark 8:29 when he says to Peter, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter acknowledges at this particular point, "You are the Messiah." But it's amazing the true identity that is revealed as he's dying on the cross. And the centurion says, "Truly this man is the Son of God." Up to that particular point, the disciples found it very difficult to understand exactly who he was and what he was about. I suppose reading Williams in 2014, when you read Mark first, you think some of the stories, you say, God, why did they not understand? He was making it very obvious. It's great for us to read in hindsight, but why did they not understand? Williams in 2014 would say they weren't stupid. It wasn't stupidity was the cause of their lack of understanding. It was just a very difficult message to grasp. And likewise, it's very difficult for us to understand. So we do need to be patient with ourselves, and we do need to reflect, because for us to get a message from Mark on our life today, it's as difficult for us as it was for the disciples when they were given the Gospel of Mark. We must work hard, but the whole entire message is, change your ways. The kingdom of God is here. Change your ways, and just live the good news. I suppose to finish with today, 3 things Mark would say about discipleship. He would talk about discipleship with Jesus. That's my personal relationship with Jesus. What is that like right now for me? He would talk about discipleship and community. Discipleship and community is very much about coming to serve. What is my role in serving? What is my role in serving as a nurse, as a mother, as a colleague, as a neighbour? We need to examine our role in discipleship of community. The third area that Mark would ask us to look at is discipleship and leadership. And you might say, I'm not a leader. I'm not a manager. We all have leadership capability. The definition of leadership is, how do we influence other people? By virtue of the fact we have the ability to influence others, we are leaders. So right now, how do I influence other people in my daily life? How do I influence people by what I say? How do I influence people by my example and my behaviours? So I would like to invite you to listen to Mark over the coming weeks, and from the perspective of the kingdom, what is he telling us about the kingdom of God? It's everyday life. That is what the kingdom of God is. How can I live everyday life as a disciple? My discipleship with my God, my discipleship in my community, and my discipleship as a leader in how I influence others. Enjoy reading Mark. God bless.